Evening, guys. Hopefully the snow day was nice for you guys. We'll be going through our chapter 36 and 37 test review tonight. Feel free to post any questions that you guys might have, and off we go. We will be starting with period two's questions. We've got a couple, and then we'll move on to period four. I don't see any for period six, so hopefully that means we've got a good understanding of what's going on with the content in that group. Miriam has the two questions from period two. What are the highlights of the Vietnam War that are to be considered on tomorrow's test? We're going to be expecting you to understand how the United States ended up getting into the Vietnam conflict. So in particular, understanding that from the time period of Eisenhower on, America following Dien Bien Phu found itself sending aid to Vietnam. And then what JFK did with Miriam's second question is asking about what is flexible response. Flexible response is JFK's strategy that's different than what Eisenhower was up to, where Eisenhower wanted to focus on massive retaliation and building up a lot of nuclear weapons, and then not having to employ a lot of soldiers because they're expensive to feed and clothe and whatever. JFK is different. He wants to have layers of different military interventions that are available to him. So depending on what the situation is, he can then use whatever is appropriate at the moment. So he wants to have a strong Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, strong nuclear deterrent with intercontinental ballistic missiles being put into place. But then he also is going to create the special forces, also known as the Green Berets, that will be able to do things militarily that are different than just standard military operations like World War II. This could be like covert operations, also known as black operations or black ops, where you've got military troops going into countries and doing things militarily that maybe is stuff that you want to keep secret or keep in a smaller sort of contained sphere. So like when you take a look at what's going on with the Vietnam War, when America starts sending advisors over to Vietnam, these advisors are Green Berets, and what they're going to be doing is they're going to be training the South Vietnamese, but more and more they're also going to be getting actively involved in the fighting against two different groups, the North Vietnamese military, but then also there are South Vietnamese people who are loyal to Ho Chi Minh in the North. They want to become communists, they're nationalistic, and they hate the idea of another invading group coming in like the United States. And so more and more the special forces find themselves fighting alongside the South Vietnamese soldiers against the Viet Cong, even though officially we're not in the war until the Gulf of Tonkin incident. Miriam's also got the question about what is the Gulf of Tonkin, and many people have posted what are the highlights from the Vietnam War that need to be understood. Gulf of Tonkin is key because in 1964, this is going to be the incident that is used by Lyndon Johnson to get us into the Vietnam conflict. The Gulf of Tonkin incident, though, is involving an American boat called the USS Maddox, and there's two very different versions of what's happening with the incident in the Gulf of Tonkin, right off the North Vietnamese coast. The Americans are going to claim that they were in international waters well away from the shore of North Vietnam, and they were minding their own business when Vietnamese ships came out and started shooting at them. The thing that made that problematic was the idea that the Maddox, compared to gunboats that the North Vietnamese had, was much bigger, much more powerful. And there's a suspicion that was going along with this incident that perhaps the Americans weren't involved in just innocently being in international waters. They were accused of being really close to the shoreline to North Vietnam to eavesdrop on their transmissions and to spy on them. An incident took place, and then the Maddox returned to the same area again and was fired upon, although afterwards there wasn't any evidence that showed damage that was indicating that we should get into a full-blown war. But what Lyndon Johnson is going to do is he's going to take the Gulf of Tonkin incident and play it up as being a gigantic threat to national security, and use this as the motivation for us to get into a full-blown war with North Vietnam. This is going to lead to what's known as the credibility gap, because what's going to happen is Johnson and Robert McNamara are going to say over and over again that we are very close to winning the war in Vietnam. When you take a look at what's going on with the Vietnam conflict, we really want you to understand things like Operation Rolling Thunder, where we've got an active bombing campaign going on in North Vietnam. And I'm expecting you to understand your Vietnam content up until the election of Richard Nixon. And then we will cover the rest of the Vietnam content with the next test as we weave it into the Nixon presidency. You also want to know the term escalation, because with escalation, you've got an understanding that with Lyndon Johnson, he keeps pouring supplies and men into Vietnam to the point where we've got hundreds of thousands of people fighting in this small country in Southeast Asia. And Johnson and McNamara keep insisting we're winning the war until the Gulf of Tonkin incident in 1968. And with Gulf of Tonkin, sorry, not Gulf of Tonkin, the Tet Offensive in 1968. Sorry, guys. With the Tet Offensive, you have a divided interpretation of how we should look at that incident. So in 1968, when Tet happens, Viet Cong forces throughout South Vietnam are going to attack every major city in the South. And when they do so, for the military, they score a major victory because they're going to end up killing more soldiers of Viet Cong allegiance than we will end up losing inside this fight. For many Americans, though, the Tet Offensive demonstrates to them that Johnson and McNamara have been lying. We're not close to victory in Vietnam at this point. In fact, we can't even get South Vietnam under control. And South Vietnam is supposed to be the country that wants us there and that we're working with. And so if we've got an active revolutionary force in South Vietnam, and we're not even talking about the North Vietnamese at this point, for many Americans in the media and also in the anti-war movement, they're going to turn against Lyndon Johnson. And that's why he's not going to run for re-election in 1968. So hopefully that helps out with the questions, the big questions of what's going on with Vietnam. You're going to find, though, that with the Vietnam conflict, it's a different conflict than what you have going on with like World War I, World War II, where you have a decisive, crucial battle to take a look at. You have Tet and you have the Gulf of Tonkin, but otherwise we want you to understand major operations that are going on, like the bombing campaigns and whatever, and the escalation that's taking place. Also, when it comes to the Vietnam War, we really want you to understand the idea that when you're president, you can either choose to spend money on domestic programs or war programs until you run out of money, and you have to figure out a balance with that. And if you need more money, you could raise taxes, which we did during World War I and World War II. But you're going to find during this time period, Lyndon Johnson is dealing with multiple threats. He wants to win the war in Vietnam, and he'd love to have it be as non-intrusive into people's lives as possible. He's also got an economy that's starting to slow down a little bit, even though we've got all of this stimulus spending going on with like social programs and war and our space race. So he's cutting taxes. And the last thing that he wants to do is explain to Americans why we need more tax money when supposedly war's victory is just around the corner. So for Lyndon Johnson, he's going to have to make choices, and by spending money on the Vietnam War, he's going to have to take money away from the Great Society, and that's going to then impact its ability to actually accomplish success in the war on poverty that he is fighting. So it looks like I'm done with period 2. Hopefully that helps. I'm moving on to period 4. And so we've got a number of questions here. Kirsten, we've got a question asking about, can I explain the Cuban incident in the JFK presidency? We've got 2 of them. One is the Bay of Pigs invasion planned by Dwight D. Eisenhower in 1959. The CIA had a planned invasion where they were planning on taking refugees who ran away from Cuba when the country became communist. We were going to train them as revolutionaries, and then we were going to help them with an invasion of their island using unmarked boats and planes to provide them air cover and water cover. But when we decided to stage the invasion in 1961, the Bay of Pigs, which used to be really isolated and wide open for invasion, now has become more populated, and so the invasion is a horrible failure. The invaders are seen coming ashore. JFK cancels the air support and the boat support. People get captured in large numbers, and this is embarrassing for JFK at the start of his presidency. There's a feeling in Russia that JFK is a guy who might be able to be pushed around because he's so naive and inexperienced. And for the Cubans, they're worried that Fidel Castro was under threat, and so they're going to be looking for any aid they can get, and that's going to lead to the installation of missiles in 1962. The Cuban Missile Crisis is the other Cuban incident where America recognizes, using their U-2 spy planes that fly over Cuba, they're able to see missile installations, and they realize that with Cuba having nuclear missiles, they could have first-rate capabilities where they could hit the United States with their nuclear weapons before America could ever fire theirs. JFK is going to resist the calls happening from his military people to attack Cuba, and thankfully he did that because of the fact that they already had armed nuclear weapons and were planning on using them. And so this incident is one that brought us to the brink of nuclear war. And it's going to be from this point forward that you see America and Russia moving away from the idea of brinksmanship, where they push each other to the edge of nuclear war because we almost blew everything up. Let me see here. Next question I see for you is about the Tet Offensive, so hopefully I've satisfied that question. Lillian, hopefully my answer for the Gulf of Tonkin did okay with that as well. Matthew, I see a question about the battles in the Vietnam War, so hopefully you're good with that. And your other question says, what do we need to know about the end of the war that happens during the Nixon and Ford presidencies? So that'll be the next test, and we'll be covering that some in class. Matthew, your question about détente is a Nixon question, but just to give you a simple explanation of what's going on with détente, you've had brinksmanship where we push Russia to the edge. Nixon's going to try out a different strategy of what he calls realpolitik, where he believes instead of having this idea that America is the greatest country and we can do whatever we want to advance democracy and freedom because we're so powerful, Nixon's foreign policy is more coming from this realistic sort of politics of recognizing we don't have unlimited money and unlimited resources. And so he's going to say we want to defend democracy if it does something to help out the United States. If it doesn't have an impact on the United States, let's say there's a terrible genocide or a civil war or other sorts of things, but it's not really in our national security interests, we're going to stay out of those conflicts from now on and not just jump into them. For Nixon also with détente, then, he's going to try to figure out how to slow down our arms race with Russia because it's really expensive to be spending that much money on the military, especially for Nixon because he'd like to figure out ways to cut taxes and regulations and government spending in a conservative sort of way. So what détente is going to do is it's going to try to figure out ways to soften the tensions between us and our communist enemies. So détente just means a decreasing of tensions and an end of brinksmanship to try out a different method of doing foreign policy. That'll be for your next test. Maggie, you've got a question about the 6-Day War, and I see a number of different people have the same sort of question. So for the 6 Days War, what we have is a war between Israel and their neighbors, including Egypt, Syria, and other countries that are nearby. Georgia's involved as well. This war is something that is woven into the Cold War as well because of the fact that many of the allies against Israel are getting their weaponry from Russia. Israel is largely getting their weapons from France, England, and the United States. And in this conflict, Egypt starts preparing for an invasion of Israel. And then Israel discovered that these plans were underway. And rather than letting the enemy attack, Israel decided to attack first while their enemies were disorganized. And so against all odds, Israel looked like it was going to be overwhelmed by multiple of their neighbors. Instead, what they're going to be able to do in the 6 Days War is they're going to be able to defeat all of their neighbors and make Israel bigger, taking over territory that's still disputed nowadays. So with this conflict, you're going to find that this conflict really shows you the tensions that's going on in the Middle East between Israel and their neighbors. It's going to show you why there's still tensions over certain areas like the Gaza Strip, the Golan Heights, and so on. And then in particular, the fact that America is one of Israel's closest allies and providing them with military weaponry is then going to make America an enemy of many of those countries because they're friends with Israel. And so we're going to see tensions rising in the Middle East as a result. Meg also has a question about what are the parts of JFK's New Frontier. It's tricky because a lot of his ideas, kind of like Harry Truman's, are going to be proposed but not put into effect. And so he wants to lower taxes. He'd like to get more people enrolled in Social Security and other sorts of safety net programs. He is somebody who is pushing for aid for disabled people, especially because of the fact that he has family members who have experienced that situation because of horrible botched surgery that was done with one of his sisters for a frontal lobotomy, leading to the creation of the Special Olympics. And a lot of these ideas that he has are going to struggle quite a bit in Congress because of the fact that with liberal ideas, they're running into problems with both Republicans and Southern Democrats who are pushing back against what JFK is trying to accomplish. Obviously, the space race is part of the New Frontier as well. And then also you can see elements that he's got with his foreign policy, whether it's like the Peace Corps or the Alliance for Progress, that could be seen as woven into both his New Frontier, but then also his foreign policy strategies. They're kind of a blend of both. We'll find, though, that a lot of his plans are going to be put to the back burner because with this New Frontier, he's going to spend a lot more time focusing on foreign policy than he will with his domestic agenda. Harrison's got a question. As far as what the main points you need to know for tomorrow, I'm assuming that you are attuned enough with your textbook that I mean, this is essentially JFK, LBJ's presidency, and the Vietnam War and the civil rights elements that overlap with that. And so if you're focusing on that content, that's where this test is going to be. Harrison, your question is about the non-inflationary wage agreement in 1962. What you have in 1962 is JFK is watching a problem take place where the economy is starting to slow down a little bit, but then also at the same time prices are starting to rise. And that's not the way the economy is supposed to work if it's classically operating the way that it should. Typically, if the economy is starting to go bad, prices will start dropping as people stop spending money. The dilemma that you have, though, during this time period is the government is not stopping the spending of its money. It's still got domestic programs and military programs and space race programs. And so what he tries to do, JFK is going to go to the steel industry because steel is something that's in all products throughout the United States. And he tries to work out a deal because they're negotiating with their workers and they're not really wanting to give them pay increases, but we've got an inflationary cycle going on. So JFK tries to do what Teddy Roosevelt did with the anthracite coal miners, and he sits down with everybody and says, all right, here's the deal. Can we get a deal done with the steel workers to give them a pay raise, but it's not going to be in money, it'll just be in benefits like vacation and health insurance and pension and whatever. And then as a steel industry, because we're going to make sure that the wages don't go up, will you guys as steel companies then promise not to increase the price of your steel? The steel companies say yes. And so what happened is the steel workers signed off on this deal where they got a 2.5% increase in their benefits, but no increase for their wages. And then immediately once that was signed, the steel companies increased the price of their steel, making the price of everything in the United States more expensive once this deal was then inked. For JFK then, he's going to call the steel industry people in and lay into them like Teddy Roosevelt did, and they're going to back down with these increases. But you're going to find that there are limits then for JFK, just with Teddy Roosevelt, on what he can do by just having personal relationships with these businesses. Future people, with Lyndon Johnson, he's going to get the impression then that if you're looking at issues like that, you may need to have things instead like minimum wage laws or whatever, because the reliance on like the businesses to make deals and work with the government, they're stuck by the fact that they have to operate in a free market, and if the market requires them to increase prices on stuff, then they need to increase the prices on stuff. Let me see here. Harrison, you've got a question that asks also about important points of the civil rights movement. You've got your organizer that will be able to help you to identify big items during that time period, and so they're all laundry listed there. Is it a lot like wars where we need to know major turning points, and if so, what would they be? Turning points are huge, especially if you're thinking about from the time of JFK's election on. You're looking for those civil rights moments that are inspiring change for JFK. So, like the Freedom Rides are putting pressure on him to change. The letter from a Birmingham jail is pushing the Civil Rights Act. So was the idea of like the March on Washington, the Selma March. So you've got incidents that when you take a look at them, they are cause and effect sort of relationships where you see major legislation passed. So you're on the right track. If you see those things on your study guide, those are definitely the places that you want to dial into with your test preparation. Let me see here. Harrison, you've also got a question about the EEC and the Trade Expansion Act of 1962. And so what you've got the EEC, that's the European Economic Council, and what's going to be happening there is that's essentially what became the European Union that you hear nowadays if you hear people talking about Brexit. And what happened is during Eisenhower and especially JFK's time period, there's an idea that if we can get the European countries to work together in one gigantic market instead of competing against one another, that could prevent future wars, because of the fact that if they ever went to war, they would then jeopardize this big economic unit that can trade with one another without trade barriers and whatever, and it would give Europe the benefit of having what America has with its states, where we can trade within our states. And our economy right now is booming and gigantic. So like you look at the state of Texas, it's outproducing most countries with their GDP. And so that's what they're trying to accomplish there with the EEC. And the Trade Expansion Act of 1962 gave JFK the power to personally lower tariffs with any countries that we wanted to facilitate trade with, to try to improve trade relations. So we would then be able to interact with them with the hope that we would then be able to influence their politics and prevent them from going to communism. It has a big dollar diplomacy feel to it, and so this is something that's very much trying to connect us with European trade and trying to figure out ways to get them to see each other less as rivals and more as allies in a European unit of markets that can trade with one another. Harrison, you've got another question about the voter education project. That was going on during the 1960s, where there was a recognition that for many African Americans in the South, they weren't voting or registering to vote because they were being deliberately misled by registrars in the South who were telling them false things about what was going on with the registration and voting process. And so what would happen is civil rights leaders would go through the South and try to explain to people, these are your rights, this is how you register, this is how you vote. Schwerner, Cheney, and Goodman were doing that during Freedom Summer. So the Freedom Summer is part of the voter education project that's trying to increase the number of African American voters in the South. Let me see, what civil rights groups are part of the Freedom Rides? It was initially CORE, and then when they got beaten savagely, then they were replaced by members of SNCC. Let me see here. Harrison also has a question. What did the Equal Opportunity Commission do? This is the enforcement arm of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So they didn't just create a Civil Rights Act and then treat it like they had done with Reconstruction, where they just threw it out there. And if states tried to nullify the law, then that was just fine. There was this Equal Opportunity Commission with equal employment especially, that would then investigate claims of segregation and discrimination. If they discovered that you were doing that, then you would face punishment from the federal government for violating the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So this is an active federal attempt to regulate what is going on with the conditions that are going on with civil rights. One of the big elements you get into, though, is in a previous generation, there would be people like the Supreme Court during the New Deal time with Schechter versus the United States, also known as the sick chicken case, where they ruled for the NRA that the chicken companies and whatever weren't involved in interstate trade and they should be immune from federal prosecution. We're going to find now that following like Brown versus Topeka Board of Education, the Supreme Court has now announced that the federal government's reach has gotten bigger. And we're going to learn then, as we move into the second part of Chapter 37, there's a series of court cases that are going to show you the Supreme Court is on board with the idea that the federal government should take a role in making sure that people's rights are protected, even if they haven't been protected in the past. Let me see here. What is the importance of the 6-Day War? Hopefully, Harrison, that you're all set and good. Let me see here. Can I explain the Stonewall Rebellion? Absolutely, although that's going to be an element that is going to be on your next test, taking a look at other civil rights movements that are inspired by the African American civil rights movement. So you're going to see, as we move into the tail end of Chapter 37, we're going to have a women's rights movement, you're going to have an environmentalist movement, and in this case with Stonewall, you're going to have an LGBTQ revolution as well, with the sexual revolution of the 1960s, where for a long time homosexuality was treated as an illegal activity. And what happened was at the Stonewall Inn, the police would oftentimes come in and harass people who were at that bar, which was very, very obviously for everybody in the area, a gay bar that people would frequent. But one night when police harassment was taking place, instead of backing down, the people who were there started to protest, and it became kind of ground zero for this LGBTQ revolution that happens in the United States, challenging laws that were in place, making their sexual orientation illegal. And so that's where that movement is going to find its roots. But we'll talk more about that as we move into the upcoming units that we're working on. Let me see. Do we need to know much of Nixon's presidency? I'm assuming not, since it says through the 68 election. 68 election is where you stop for this test. And then this upcoming week is when we focus on the 1970s, Nixon, Ford, and Carter. And it'll take us about a week to get through the 1970s. and then we'll be quickly into the 1980s. So for your Nixon stuff that you find yourself getting into at the end of chapter 37, let that be for right now. Although it's great that you've read that, you're just gonna be testing through the 68 election itself. Sam, hopefully my explanation of the European Economic Community served you well. Let me see here. Harrison, what's the major difference between the SDS, SCLC, SNCC, and the NAACP? So three of those four groups are going to be civil rights movements for African American civil rights. And you've actually got them flipped around in chronological order. So the first one we want to know about is the NAACP. Founded by W.E.B. Du Bois, this is going to be a civil rights group that is working to desegregate through the courts. And so started in 1909, they protested against Birth of a Nation. They're the ones who helped to bring the Brown versus Topeka Board of Education lawsuit. And they're the ones who had typically tried to seek a challenge that they could bring through the Supreme Court that would then allow them to advance the cause of civil rights. Very much a more moderate group than the other civil rights groups, not actively protesting, but supporting the protesters themselves. The SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, is going to be Martin Luther King's group of ministers who are working to employ Christian principles in their nonviolent protests. They're the ones who are involved in like the Montgomery bus boycott, and they will then eventually start getting more and more aggressive because they're being nudged in that direction by SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Following 1960s with the Freedom Rides, you'll have then both SNCC and the SCLC engaged in nonviolent protests that are trying to gain attention on the television. But then after the end of de jure segregation with the Voting Rights Act, you'll find that SNCC becomes much more aggressive with pursuing civil rights, and very much you see a tendency for them to become more militant and more embracing of the Black Power movement. And this is going to cause divides to happen in the civil rights movement, especially with the death of Martin Luther King. The SDS, though, is the Students for a Democratic Society. This is a student movement that's happening on college campuses, and you've got at the University of Michigan, you've got at University of California, Berkeley, you've got these students who are on campus who are part of the baby boom. So you've got the largest group of young people in United States history, combined with the fact that they're now the largest group of kids coming from the middle to upper classes, and they're being aided by the GI Bill and their parents' economic success to be able to go to college. And many of these kids, when they go off to college, they're becoming very attuned to these ideas. They don't like conformity. They've been influenced by the beatniks, and many of them will move towards the hippie movement of the 1960s. Many of them are finding that with the television, they're watching injustice on television, and they're feeling injustice themselves. So for many of these kids, when they go off to college, they're going to get involved in what's known as the free speech movement, which again, we're going to cover when we move into our next unit. But for many of these kids, they were finding that if they wanted to speak on campus, they would have to get the college dean to say that it was okay for them to be able to speak on campus freely. Meanwhile, they were finding that groups like the ROTC would be able to speak pretty freely on campus about why kids should join the military, but then they would find more anti-war messages or more pushback on civil rights being rejected by the presidents of these colleges. And so for many of these kids, they start protesting themselves using the same methods that Martin Luther King is using to try to achieve their own rights. And then with that little taste of injustice that they have, many of them start branching out into the other now forming civil rights movements. They'll join into the African American civil rights movement, and many of the people who are involved in Freedom Summer are people who were influenced by the SDS and wanted to figure out ways to then actively make change start happening in their society. Again, with the foundation of the African American civil rights movement, though, the end of chapter 37, I'm going to run through all these different civil rights movements that are going to cause a lot of change and a lot of upheaval. A lot of our current tensions that we have between conservative and liberal are coming from the foundations of protests that are happening during this time. And now that we've got the African American civil rights movement down, we'll be able to relate techniques that are being used by these other groups that were created initially by Martin Luther King or others, and then we'll be able to see what changes are taking place. Let me take a look one more time and see if I've got any more questions posted from period 4. Got nothing more for period 4. Let me take a look at period 6. Okay, so Trina, we've got a question. When did Americans begin to turn against the Vietnam War? It's going to be. Let me see here. Sorry about that. Sorry. We're going to find that at the beginning of the war, the Vietnam War was quite popular, and we're gonna see that in 1964, especially, many Americans thought it would be a super quick war, and many Americans were on board with the war through 1964 and 1965, as Lyndon Johnson was sending back rosy messages about what was going on with the war effort. Given the fact, though, that we aren't coming out of like a depression, or we aren't coming out of a time period of the Gilded Age, we're going to find that even though the war seems winnable, you're going to have large groups of Americans who in the past would have volunteered for the war. They're not volunteering for the war. And many of them saw what happened in Korea and sensed that Vietnam is going in that same sort of direction. And so if kids have options, they're not choosing to volunteer the way that they should. And there's different ways that they'll be able to dodge the draft, either by getting a medical exception, or getting into college, or doing a number of other different things to avoid the war. And so when you take a look at anti-war protesters, these are the kids who oftentimes would find themselves in danger of being drafted. But many of them are also very mad about what is being called a rich man's war but a poor man's fight, where you've got a war that's being started by people here in the United States who are saying this is a great idea, but it's being fought by kids who really don't have any choice in the process. During this time period, the voting age was 21, but you could be drafted into the military at the age of 18. And many people saw that as being unjust, that for 3 years you're good enough to carry around an automatic weapon and kill people in another country, but you're not allowed to choose your commander-in-chief who makes the decision about if you're leaving the country. We will find, though, that in 1966, 67, escalations taking place. We have thousands of people in Vietnam. The war keeps dragging on, and Lyndon Johnson keeps saying that it's getting better. And this is where you start having student protesters who start merging together with civil rights protesters. And in fact, it's during this time period that Martin Luther King goes from being really tight with LBJ to being very much against LBJ, because it's during that period of 1966 to 67 that Martin Luther King changes his arguments, where he's going to say, look, it's great that we got rid of de jure segregation. It's great Civil Rights Act, Voting Rights Act is in place. We still have tons of discrimination, but then he starts branching out and pointing out, if you are white or a minority in the United States, you stand a much better chance of being drafted if you're poor and you lack the resources to be able to evade the war itself. And he's also pointing out that if you are African American, it's really odd that you're going off to a war where you're fighting for the rights of other people while you are being denied your rights here. And then he also highlights the fact that in the war, there are many people in Vietnam who don't want us there. And so we're going to find that this is a complicated war. It's hard to explain what is the goals for the war. And then in 1968, everything goes bad with the Tet Offensive, and that undermines Lyndon Johnson. We're going to see a rebound, though, with Richard Nixon, because what Richard Nixon is going to announce throughout his campaign is that he's going to have peace with honor, where we're going to win the war in Vietnam. But he says he's got a secret plan for winning the war, and he can't tell you about what the secret plan is. Otherwise, it wouldn't be a secret anymore. But what he says is you could either vote for me with my secret plan or Hubert Humphrey, who is going to carry on Lyndon Johnson's ideas. And so Nixon is going to win the election in 1968 with his secret plan. The problem, though, is in 68, Lyndon Johnson almost had the Vietnam War ended, according to many people who surround Lyndon Johnson. But from people who surrounded Nixon, there's evidence now that people in the Nixon campaign were contacting the groups in North Vietnam and South Vietnam, telling them, don't negotiate with Johnson. I'll give you a better deal when I get elected, to help ensure Nixon's election. And sadly, then what happened is Nixon promised we were going to end the war. And as you saw from your Vietnam War video, instead of ending it, he starts pulling troops out of Vietnam, but then he also invades neighboring countries like Cambodia and increases our bombing campaigns. And our war's not going to end until 1974, when South Vietnam collapses and we end up losing the Vietnam War. So for Richard Nixon, he has this moment of people giving him the benefit of the doubt. And then from 69, 70, 71, everything starts going downhill, as we'll study when we move into Nixon next week. Let me take a look and see if I've got any other questions that are posted here. Nothing for period 6. Nothing for period 4. Nothing for period 2. So hopefully you guys are doing well. Hopefully I get a chance to see you guys tomorrow. The weather's supposed to still be treacherous and nasty overnight. So if you are one of my drivers, be super careful as you're working your way, and it's supposed to be icy and messy. But I do hope I get a chance to see you tomorrow. We'll be taking your test first. It's a 25-question test. And then afterwards, I'll be returning to you guys your final exam that you guys had for your practice test. And then if you don't get enough time to look it over tomorrow, I'll be able to save it for you so you can take a look at that early next week as well. Have a great night, you guys.